All right, welcome back, everybody. It's that time again, another one of the Madcap Software famous webinars. Now, this time we have a special guest host, Ray Davis, the Technical Writing Manager at Medtronic. He is going to be taking the Madcap microphone, and he's going to be talking to us about build events. Now, if you're not familiar with build events, it's a part of every target that you create. You have the ability to add build events. I'll let Ray go into more detail. But before we get started, though, a couple of webinar announcements, because we tend to get the same questions over and over again. So yes, the webinar will be recorded, just like all of our webinars are. So if you have to pop out for a minute and come back, no worries. You can always review the recording once it's posted. Or if you want to share this with colleagues, again, probably later today, early tomorrow, this webinar will end up being posted on our main website. Also, for those who are here live, if you have questions, you may have noticed your microphones are on mute. That's to protect your privacy and to protect the recording. You can still ask questions, though. As part of this webinar software, there is a question and answer panel. If you want to open that up, you can always type in a quick question. If it's something that I can help out and answer with, I will provide you a text answer. If it's something that we need Ray to cover, then I will flag that, and hopefully at the end we'll have a few minutes for a quick question and answer period. But Ray will not be taking questions live during the session. That tends to be distracting. I'll try to help with what I can, and then everything else will defer to that Q&A section at the end of the meeting. But with that, without further ado, I would like to hand things over to Ray Davis for his presentation on build events.
Thanks for that introduction, Mike, and thanks for everyone joining me today. I really appreciate your interest in build events. I've talked about build events a couple of times now. It's something I'm really excited about because I see it as having a lot of potential for how we use our content and how we manipulate our content. And I hope to be able to share some of that excitement with you today. To let you know what you can expect today, we'll start with some level setting. What are build events? What can I do with build events? You might have some preconceived notions about what build events are and what they can do. I hope to break those preconceived notions. And if you have high expectations for build events, which I hope you do, but aren't sure how to get there, I hope you come away from this session with a good idea of how to start making it happen. I have a couple of functional examples that I want to show you so you can see what a build event can do. In the download for this session that'll be available in the next day or so, I'm going to include my sandbox so you can run these build events on your own and you can see what they're capable of. I'm not going to spend too much time on the examples though. The nature of the build event is that it's automation. You have a set of scripts that run with a build, and once you have your environment set up, it should just run. Once you have your environment set up, it should just run. So I'd rather spend the time today giving you the tools to get set up and running and being able to use these build events. Also, let me say, these examples, the templates and the page layouts are not something that I spent my time on. You're going to see a lot of unattractive pages. I mean, really unattractive pages. The goal of these examples is to show you how you can make changes to your data, not necessarily to show off a style sheet or a layout. It's to show you the power of a build event. We're going to talk a little bit about what is XML and what is XSL and why this works in this particular situation. And this is going to be in the context of getting the most out of a build event, to show you that this is a tool that you can use when you just can't find anything else to solve your problems. We'll talk about what you need to make the build event portable from project to project and from writer to writer. The bane of all developers is the phrase, but it works on my machine. It needs to work on your machine and on your projects, but also on your counterparts' machines, on your coworkers' machines. So let's make sure you can move these scripts around. We've got some lessons learned. that I want to share with you. And then finally, what do you need specifically to make this work for you? What am I using? Why do I need a build event? What can it do for me? So let's talk for just a second about what Flare is really good at when it comes to data, because it's good at a lot of things. Flare is really good at reusing data, at formatting data very consistently, about maintaining some assumptions about data use. So tables, spans, classes, even variables and targets, they infer what you want, they imply what you want your data to do, what you want your data to be used for. Flare is also very good at making decisions about data at a very high level. For example, I can add keywords to pages. Adding keywords to individual pages based on the content is a bit more challenging though. So Flare is not yet good at changing specific pieces of data based on specific testable circumstances. When you search for information about build events online, the most common example that you find is a move script. So after a build is complete, a script like this takes all of the information in your output directory and it moves it, for example, to a network directory. This is akin to a publication function. But what if I want to add keywords to an individual page based on the content of that specific page? What if I want to display measurements in a specific region-specific format? So imperial versus metric, gallons versus liters, leagues versus meters, as an example, a sort of do-it-yourself localization. Flare lets me take advantage of these things with a build event. So specifically, what is a build event? Very simply, a build event is a set of command line commands that you can send from the Flare build to the Windows shell. Again, the examples that I see most often are things like making directories, copying and moving files, but it's more than this. It's a way, these build events that I'm going to show you today, it's a way to transform your content, both before and after you build your project. You can add to the content, you can change the content, you can delete the content, you can move the content, you can do all the things that you've seen in those previous examples, plus you can actually change the data. So let's see a couple of build events in action. I want to start by saying that these examples probably aren't practical. I'm going to show you two examples today, and they're probably not anything you're actually going to need or you're actually going to do in a real life scenario. What they do, though, is they demonstrate the flexibility of this kind of build event. I mentioned in the introduction how I might want to add keywords to a specific page. For example, I might want to facilitate search engine optimization, but I only want keywords to appear on an HTML page when that word is actually present in the content. For example, I don't want to add the keyword fire extinguisher to a page where I'm talking about fire hoses. I can use the old Mark I eyeball to examine every piece of content that I want to publish, and I can add keywords as I find them. But that becomes a really, really manual process. And if you're like me and my team, we have hundreds, possibly thousands of pieces of topic. That keyword list might change over time. That keyword list might change from build to build, day to day even. And how are you going to devote the resources to do this examination of all of your content every time you build it and every time you publish it? I'd rather throw some automation at the problem and use a build event. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to Flare, and I'm going to show you this build event in action. So what we have here is a project. It's got some very unattractive pages in it. This is one piece of content that talks about smoke detectors and radar detectors and radon in the home. And I have a list of keywords. So radon, money, tires, etc. These are all based on words that I know are present in my actual content. So this is going to be a little bit like a magic trick. I'm going to show you what's happening, and I'm going to show you what the content looks like before, and then I'm going to show you what the content looks like after. So this is the before content. It's very straightforward, just a paragraph. You can see in here, it's just a paragraph with very little, almost no markup at all except the HTML. And you have here an empty head node. There's nothing going on in this node. There's not even a title here. It's just very straightforward. It's very rudimentary. In my build, I have, or rather in my target, I have under build events, I have the script for my build event, and we'll go over what all this information means here in just a minute. But I just want to show you that there is this build events tab in your target, and this is where you enter the information for your build event. So I'm going to go ahead and build this project. It's very small. It'll only just take just a second. It's done. The PostBuild Event command has been done. There's no warnings and there's no errors. So let's have a look at the output. We're going to look at this piece of content that I just showed you in Flare. We're going to look at this. It's going to be easiest to look at it in Notepad. And you see all the same content. This hasn't changed. This is just a straightforward HTML publication. But now there's a bunch of stuff going on in the head node. One of the things that you see here is this metadata description. This is keywords. And you can see now there's a list of keywords that have been added to this node. The node was added, and then keywords were added to this node. So radon is present here. Carbon is present here. Smoke is present here. Homes is present here. Safety is present here. In our original keyword list, we saw things like tires and road and sale. We don't see those here in the keyword list because they're not present in the content. So what's going on here? What does this do? This build event, it compares the content of the body node in each of the result documents. And when a keyword is found, it compares the content of the body node to a list of keywords. And when a keyword is found in that content, the XSL adds the keyword to the head node, the data node. If the metadata node already exists, it appends the keyword to the list that's already there, and then it iterates through the keyword list over and over, repeating from step one, and then it repeats through the result documents over and over, looking for each keyword in the keyword list. I give this a difficulty level of 2 thumbs. It's not terribly difficult. The thing that you really have to do here is just create a keyword list as an XML file, and each keyword has to have its own XML node. Your XML, or rather your XSL, has to be aware of the keyword structure so it can iterate through that structure and iterate through your result list. But other than that, it's just this recursive iteration. You can see here I have a keyword list, and in it is a list node, and in the list node is each keyword. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the first keyword, and I'm going to compare that to the body node, and when it finds it, it's going to append that information to the metadata node that's being created. I have another one here called convert units. So let's take a quick look at that. This is that same piece of content. I've added some information here about where smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors should be located. And you see these measurements, 6 feet, 18 inches, and so forth, 6 feet over here. We'll look at the text real quickly. And what you can see is this is just another paragraph, but I've added a span around these measurements. And the class is, in this case, inches to meters, and in this case, it's feet to meters. So let's go over to the build. And again, the build, in the build event, I'm sorry, in the target, there's this build event entry, and we've got this this build event that we're going to run. Should be very quick again. So the PostBuild there's a piece of content in a web browser so that you can see what's happened. And now what we've done is we have the original measurement, but in this parenthetical element, we also have the conversion to the metric value. So we have feet to meters, we have inches to meters, and then we have feet to meters here. Looking at what's going on behind the scenes here, oops. There's nothing special that's gone on behind the scenes. It's just the original text, and then I've added these parenthetical elements. So what's happening here? What's happening in this particular build event? The XSL is looking in the result document set, and it's looking in that output set of documents, and it's looking for a span tag around a numeric value. It's reading the name attribute in that span, and then it's converting that value in that node to the requested unit of measure. And then it's taking the original value that it brought in, so 6 feet, and it's taking the converted value, and it's sending that to an output function. And what that output function does is it allows me to create a very consistent output. You saw that in the output, it was always the original measure value, the converted unit of measure, close parentheses, space. That's all the result of the output function. I give this 3 thumbs in terms of difficulty. So why is that? This one actually requires some forethought as to what you want to convert. Do you want to convert all metric to all standard, or all standard to all metric? What if you want to do something where you want to convert, like if you are specifically dealing with nautical measurements, so converting feet to leagues, or leagues to miles, or knots to miles per hour, and back again, that sort of thing. It really requires some forethought as to what it is that you want to convert. And with that forethought comes the formula. So you need some math skills. I'll be the first to admit, my math skills, when it comes to something like this, I go to the internet. What does that formula look like, and how do I write that? And you have to be able to write that formula in something that is XSL-based math, not it's typically not operator math. So you've got the plus and the minus and the multiplication. For the most parts, those operators are all valid, but the division is a little bit different because a slash in XSL indicates a path. So you can't use that. So you have to use a reserve word, div, to actually get that. There's a couple of things like that, but you have to be able to write that formula in a way that XSL can use it and understand it. And then typically I would recommend putting something like this in a library, putting a group of conversions into specific libraries and just adding the libraries as you need them. Again, it requires some forethought, it requires some planning, but what that allows you to do is take all of your, as an example, nautical conversions and put them in a single library and use those only as needed. Your standard to metric and metric to standard, that's going to be a big library, but it's all in the same place. You could break it out by distance or volume, as an example. So what it really does is it allows you to be flexible without cluttering up your scripts with a bunch of stuff you don't need, while at the same time providing that flexibility to convert many different things if you need them. So why would I do something like this? This seems like a lot of work for something that I might be able to just write in the original source code. Why would I go to the effort of something like this? So what I would say is there's a couple of reasons you might consider doing something like this. Localization, I had mentioned at the beginning, sort of this do-it-yourself localization. So I add a script and I convert standard to metric based on an audience. And it allows me as the writer to not focus on doing math, not focus on that conversion. Is it the proper conversion? I can just add the build event for the geography that I'm going to be publishing into, and I can get that immediately. In my output, I had the standard value displayed and the metric in parentheses. There's no reason that your output function can't be just the metric, just the converted unit. I chose to put both of them side by side to show what you could do, but you don't have to do that. What about if you want specific location-specific information? So as an example, an airport altimeter reading or currency. If I can set this up to always convert over to the British pound as an example. Another good reason here would be harmonization, medical device documentation, which is something that me and my team do. We've done for a really long time. All units of measure are supposed to be metric with the standard in parentheses afterwards. And we get all mixes of units of measure from our engineering group. So sometimes we get inches, sometimes we get feet. But for us, as a writer creating this documentation, it's always supposed to be metric with standard in parentheses. So this allows me to either put metric with standard in parentheses, or if I'm only getting the standard, put that in, but I can do this conversion on demand. And the last thing I was thinking about might be something that might be a little bit more practical, but something like a discount price or a sale price. If you have a list of products with a retail price on them, and you don't want to have to change your source code to put something on sale, you could do something like this, where you run this build event to convert those sale prices at the end, or those retail prices at the end into your sale prices. And it happens at build time, and you don't have to change the original source. You can enter a percent that you want to be the discount, and it just does it at the end, at the build. And one more sort of unexpected use that I thought of for this was actually doing some sort of redaction. You can do this where you replace all that information with just X's or asterisks or something like that. There is no conversion. It is just a straight replacement. So if you want to send a sample of your documentation to a potential client, but you don't want them to be able to see specifications for calibration or something like that, you can redact the specifications for calibration and just show them that you have the procedure, but the specific information about how to maintain a product is hidden. So why does all this work? Why does this work? Almost everything in Flare is held in XML. Certainly all the topics are in XML. And in fact, almost everything in the project folder is XML, which means theoretically that almost everything in the project folder can be read and manipulated by XSL. I say all this recognizing that the HTML that that your source topics are actually held in it's HTML, but HTML is in fact valid XML. I'm drawing the distinction between the very rigid nature of something like a data style valid XML and the much more forgiving nature of XHTML, but XHTML is indeed a valid XML. XSL can read XML, and therefore it can make decisions on the information in the XML. That is to say, I can make inferences about data, and I can make decisions about what to do with that data based on the inferences that I read from the XML. As an example, XSL can read a variable and choose what to do based on that variable. If you have a variable that says that this is a draft, it's a draft switch during your build, I can decide to append to every H1 the word draft, so that when in a build event, when it reads that this is a draft, it adds the word draft to every heading. XSL can scan a node, such as a paragraph, and it can determine if a string is present in that node. We saw that with add metadata. It can parse that node, and it can transform characters in that node. And we saw that with the math that we're doing in the convert units, and we can see that when we do character encoding. XSL transforms XML, and almost everything in Flare is XML. We talked a little bit about what a build event can do. So let's talk about what's happening programmatically when you run a build event. This is what I thought happened in a pre-build event. I thought the build starts, it finds a pre-build event and pauses. The build pauses and executes the build event, then continues with the build. I had this brilliant idea of altering the target file before the build starts in earnest. No joy, that does not work. As near as I can tell, at the time of the build, the TOC and the target at minimum are read into memory. They're not fixed or locked in any way. You can alter them, but the build isn't aware of that alteration until the next build occurs. We experimented with forcing a pause, with pausing the build so that I could read and alter the target file. You can force a pause with DOS commands, but there's really no point because you can't pause the build. We started experimenting with creating a dummy build that altered a second target and then initiated a separate build using that second target. And at that point, the whole thing became pointlessly and hopelessly convoluted. The intent here is just to say that the build event happens with the build. This is what you need to know about what happens. The build itself starts, the pre-build event kicks off and runs completely independently of the build. The build just plows ahead. The build event, it runs, it fails, it completes, it crashes, whatever. The build is agnostic and ambivalent to the build event. It doesn't know and it doesn't care. The build continues regardless of what's happening with the build event. It's truly parallel, or as truly parallel as you can get in a threaded system like what we use on Windows. By comparison, what happens in a post-build event is extremely straightforward. It's extremely simple. The build kicks off, the build completes, the build event does not start until the build is complete. That's what we were seeing in these last two examples that we had. These were post-build events. The build ran, and then we were performing transformations on the result set of the information that was created. If you have a pre-build event and a post-build event, everything that you saw on the previous slide happens for the pre-build event, and then everything that you see here happens for the post-build event. They happen in parallel. I said earlier that the bane of all developers is it works on my machine, and it does need to work on your machine. It also needs to work on everybody else's machine. So let's make sure that we can move these scripts around. Everyone's going to need the XSLT executable. This is the engine. This is the XSLT engine that's taking in the source files and making the changes. It needs to be on everybody's machine, and it needs to be in a well-known location. And when I say a well-known location, it needs to be something that is available to other applications to use. We set an environment variable. An environment variable, if you don't know, is basically a shortcut that the computer uses to do something. It can be a value such as your name or your employee ID. It can be a path to a location. It can be a path to an executable. It's a way of creating a shortcut And you especially want to do this if you have to put your executable in a place that has a long, complicated absolute path. You want to make the environment variable point to the executable itself. The scripts also, keep them in a repository. So we use Subversion, we use SVN, and we have a specific repository in SVN for scripts. And then we bring them down, we download them to our sandbox. And this is a way to back them up and to go back to a functional copy if you inadvertently alter something. You'll see that the first command in a build event is always a change directory, and you'll see why in just a moment. After that, you always invoke the batch file, and I always call the batch file that invokes the build event index.bat. It's a standardization, and it's going to make your life a lot more simple. If you have multiple build events that you're using, it's always index.bat. You don't have to remember, okay, is this convert units? Is it convert unit? Is it metadata? Where am I at and what am I doing? It's always .bat or index.bat. Build events traverse the Windows directory, and they do it in a way that's relative rather than absolute. This is probably the #1 hindrance that you'll have in making your build events work from user to user. Even in a highly regulated corporate environment like I work in, users personalize their space. A great example of this is that one of my writers, they put their sandbox at the C root level. I put my sandbox on the desktop. Along with everything that I've ever worked on since I worked for this company, it's on my desktop with everything. My desktop is a mess. You would be shocked. Another employee doesn't even bother with Sandbox. They work on one project at a time, and they just download the trunk to their work directory, where that happens to be. You need the proper starting location, though, to make the build event work. This is probably the most relevant statement that you can take away from this entire discussion. It's going to be the linchpin to your success or failure in getting build events to work. Build events begin traversing the Windows directory at the place that the application is instantiated. So that's probably the desktop if you have a shortcut on your desktop that you use to start Flare. It might be the start menu or the taskbar, but these are shortcuts to shortcuts to shortcuts. And it's going to be buried not on your desktop, but somewhere in a user directory somewhere, in a user-based directory somewhere. And you might be one of those strange few that actually go to the Flare directory and start the application directly from there. What this is not is, it is not the project location. The build event does not start traversing the Windows directories in the in the project location, in the script location, in the XSLT location. It begins traversing the Windows directory at the place that the application is started, at that place that the application is instantiated. So if we want our scripts to be portable from one machine to another, you need to know, and you know that every user is going to be different. We need a way to solve this. We need a way to make each script run regardless of where it's stored, and regardless of how the system is configured, and regardless of how you start Flare. There's a lot of variables there. So we need a way to consistently start our build events in one location. First way we can do this is we can set a starts in target in the shortcut for the application. So if you right click on the shortcut and pull up the properties box, there is a starts in box there, and you can put in a location there that is well known, that you know that your build event can start in. The advantage of this fix is, well, there's really not many. In fact, I can only really think of one advantage, and that's that it works. It actually works. But there's a lot of disadvantages. The main one is that it really doesn't address the problem. It addresses a symptom. It doesn't fix the problem in a programmatic way, and this is a programmatic solution that we're using with the build event. So we want it to be as consistent as possible. Doing it this way, it just feels kludgy. I'm not sure it works, but it's not that great. you'll see I begin every build event with a change directory, and it's an absolute path. So let's go back over to Flare real quick and look at this. So here's our build event. The first command is, it's a change directory, and I'm sending it directly to this location where the script is being housed. And then I have index.bat, which is the build event itself. This allows you to put your scripts anywhere and call them from anywhere, because the command is absolute. It doesn't matter where it begins traversing the Windows directory. It just goes straight to the location where the build event is stored, and it begins executing from there. The advantage here is that it works, and it's absolutely reliable. It works 100% of the time. And because it's just a change command, just a change directory command, you don't need any sort of elevated privilege to execute this kind of command on your machine. If you have access to the Windows shell through the command window, you can execute this kind of command. It's completely innocuous. It's completely harmless. The disadvantage to this is that this information travels with the target. It travels with the build. So when that target goes from your machine, comes to your machine from somebody else's machine, you have to remember to make that change. You have to remember that you have to go in here and in this build event, change it from whatever path it is to your counterpart's scripts directory. You have to change it to your own scripts directory. And honestly, this can be confusing for less senior writers or writers who are not familiar with or are not comfortable with doing something like paths. I've seen it. I still think it's the best way to do this because it's very consistent. But you just have to remember to do it, and it's really easy to walk somebody through it if they have issues. That's the hard one. That's the one that's really going to bog you down. So how about some easy ones? No spaces in any of the path names. So your sandbox name, your project name, your target name. DOS doesn't handle spaces in paths and spaces in names well. It tends to see that as the end of the path or the end of the command, and it can really be a problem. Project names and target names are the ones where I see this happen the most often. We look at these and we give these user-friendly, human-readable names that often include spaces, perhaps even special characters, exclamation points, that sort of thing. Flare uses this information in a programmatic way, not just in a human readable way. So it's important to recognize that this information, it's going to be used programmatically as well as to be used by you as a label. Special characters in the path, so you don't want spaces. We just talked about that. Slashes tend to be in XSL interpreted as part of the path. So you can be directing your XSL to a location that it can't find if you're using that. Special characters like the trademark symbol, copyright symbol. I remember we inadvertently added a trademark symbol to the name of a target because it was the target was the name of a product. And it worked kind of, but I think more accidentally. I would say avoid special characters, avoid extended characters as much as possible. You'll be a lot happier. This one's going to seem really obvious, but I started with Notepad as my XSL editor, and I made a ton of mistakes. I wasted so much time trying to make my build events work because I wasn't willing to ask for a dedicated XSL editor. Once I switched over to an SDK, everything went really fast, everything went really well. So you're going to be tempted to use Notepad. And even if you are really, really good with XSL, you're going to have problems. I would really recommend just go ahead and request that XSL editor and you'll be a lot happier. DOS help is actually really helpful. Don't be afraid to use it. Almost all of the help that I needed on some of these DOS commands, I got from the DOS help in Windows. It's very straightforward. It's very helpful. Don't be afraid to use it. In Flare, there's no error handling for build events. Any error is going to completely torpedo the build event The build is just going to move along. And as long as the build isn't depending on any sort of build event to complete, or the output of a build event to complete the build's going to just shrug its shoulders and leave the build event behind like it never happened. In the examples that I was showing you, you saw that the first thing I did at the end of the build was check to see if there were any errors or any warnings. That's an indication to me that the build event did not complete correctly. And that's sort of the extent of the error handling for build events in Flare. You can see here the build event number in the build log has changed over time. I'm pretty sure that this is correct up through its current through the current build of Flare. But if you are having trouble with your build event, Flare really isn't going to help you, and it shouldn't. I mean, this isn't what Flare does. Flare has the opportunity. It's giving you the opportunity to run these scripts, but it's not making any claims that it's going to help you with these scripts. So you're kind of on your own a little bit there. So what do you need to make this work on your machine? You need an XSLT, an Extensible Style Sheet Language Transformer. It has to run from a DOS command line, and it has to be XSL 2.0 capable. I think the XSL standard is currently 2.5 or 2.6. So even if you go back in time to an older one, even 5 or 10 years, you're probably going to be just fine as long as what you're using is fairly current. Even the older versions are going to go back to XSL 2.0. So just as long as it's capable of doing that, you're fine. Some good examples are Apache Xalen, Saxon. Microsoft Windows used to have an XSL transformer native inside Windows. It was only XSL 1.0, and it's no longer supported for Microsoft, so that one's really not going to be a great option. What am I using? I'm using a product called Altova XML 2008. It's free to use. It's free to distribute as long as you include the licensing agreement. It's got a very small footprint. It's only I think it's less than 10 megabytes in size. It's a single executable, so it can live anywhere and you can move it anywhere, and it's easy to move. A lot of the bigger, more professional XSLTs like Xalen and Saxon, they have a lot of library files that have to be included with it, and they're difficult to move. They create environment variables and registry entries when you install them. This one is just a single executable. It's extremely versatile. I've used it for years. It's very, very, very good. And like I said, by my read of the licensing agreement, you can distribute it, you can use it and distribute it as long as you include the licensing agreement, which, glad you asked. In the download for this session, I have in fact included this transformer. So in addition to my sandbox and the scripts, you will also get this transformer, and you should be able to set this up so that you can do the transformations on your own using these tools. The disadvantage here is that it's no longer supported by Altova, and it can be difficult to find. So, the easy answer is just use the one that I sent you, but if you have some sort of corporate standard that you're using, like Xalen or Saxon, those should work as well. And then the XSL editor, I'm using one that I'm very comfortable with. There's a lot of them out there. If you've done any sort of XSL, you have your favorite. This isn't a sales pitch for XSL editors. This is about what we can do with Madcap Flare. So I kind of wanted to avoid talking about that tool specifically, because it's just, if you've done any sort of XSL, you have one that you're comfortable with. If you think this is pretty cool, and I hope you do, I want to give you an idea of what some of the other stuff that we do with build events. To one extent or another, we have used every one of these build events. We've built them and we've used them at some point or another. Add scripts, so this is just like add metadata, except we're adding a pre-written JavaScript to a page, again, based on content on that page, and then we're altering an existing node to run the script. So this could be an email link. Most common, this is it's adding some sort of onload attribute to the body node so that this script will execute when the page loads. encode and decode. So this is a really interesting one. It allows us to take any one character and encode it as multiple characters. So A now is 1221, B is 1224, and so forth. And then we decode it. We're able to decode it. Whenever you see 1224, hey, that's an A. 1224, hey, that's a B. So we can encode and decode information. This is kind of James Bondy. I know that there's a ton of stuff out there that's a lot better at encoding, decoding information. This was more of a proof of concept. One of the things that we did use this for was to encode URLs. So it's kind of neat, but probably not very practical. Judgment Day is one of our favorites. This is, if you understand the reference, you'll understand when I say that this is code that writes and executes its own code. So we're using a build event. The build event looks at a variable. Based on what the variable says, it writes another batch file and it executes that batch file. And then at the end of it, it deletes that batch file, kind of gets rid of the evidence, and that's your build event. We call it Judgment Day. It's sort of our inside joke. And then the last one we're working with right now is convert red lines. We're experimenting with this, but what we do is we're to edit topics, and then we're converting those red lines to conditional text. And what this allows us to do is work on multiple revisions at the same time within the same piece of content, without having to use without having to use a branch in your revision control. It's a little atypical of how you would use revision control, but it's something that we needed in our particular organization, and it's pretty neat, it's pretty clever, and it's something that has shown good results for us. So that's my presentation. I know that Mike has some things that he wants to follow up on, and then we'll take some questions. I want to thank everyone for coming, and thanks for your kind attention, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. Mike?
All right. Thanks, Ray. So the first thing before we get to the Q&A is I just did want to remind everybody, we are going forward with Mad World this year. Because of the state of the world, there is going to be an online participation option for those who are still a bit iffy about showing up in person. However, a lot of us will be there in person, so if you're comfortable with that, then you can come on down. It will be in a new venue this year. It has been in San Diego traditionally for North America. I know that was difficult for some people to get to. So it's actually going to be near our Austin office. We're going to be holding Mad World in Austin, Texas, October 3 through 6. So if subjects like this are interesting to you, imagine, 2+ full days of education like this. And we typically run multiple tracks. I have to talk to the marketing folks. I know traditionally we've run 4 tracks simultaneously. At any particular time zone or time frame, there was a beginner session, an intermediate session, an advanced code level session, and then a tools agnostic session. Just, theory, CSS, single sourcing, things like that. We might be down to 3 tracks this year as we bring things back online post-COVID or post-lockdown. But again, it's a good time for everybody involved. Anybody who's been there, I've never heard any bad things. So if that's time available on your calendar, you can think about Mad World. And then I believe we have one more announcement. If we can click that slide forward. There is an offer for anybody who has attended this webinar. You can just mention this if you're looking about doing, a purchase or an upgrade. They're offering 6 months of free extension on any purchase to your subscription. So again, there is no fancy code you have to share. Just mention you heard about this offer to your salesperson, and they know how to add that code on their end. All right, so that is it for the announcements. Now we can get to the Q&A. Now I've tried to cover as many of the questions as I could. Now that Ray's had a chance to breathe for a minute, he can go back and review some of my questions, make sure I didn't boy, I almost used an old Navy term there. I didn't mislead anybody. Now, one question that was rather common, and I have tried to answer this to everybody who asked, but I'll put this to Ray because maybe he probably knows far more than I do in this regard. It seems like a lot of the post-build events that were running scripts focused on changing content were focused on HTML-based outputs. There were several people asking, could we do that to PDF outputs? I told them they couldn't, but Ray, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
You're not wrong. With a post-build event, you're not going to be able to impact a PDF. PDF is a binary, and you're just not going to be able to make any sort of alteration to a binary. However, that having been said, I had mentioned that one of the things that we did was called Judgment Day. And what it did was it wrote and executed its own script. And what the script that it writes does is it actually alters the CSS. And we run this as a pre-build event before the PDF is generated. What we're doing right now is we're altering the numbering scheme slightly for a draft version versus an output version. So if you want to alter a PDF, there's a couple of ways you can do it. You can use something that alters the that alters the CSS, like I just described. Or we've experimented with this. We've experimented with, it gets a little convoluted, but altering, so what we did was we copied the original topics off to a holding area. We altered the topics. Then we let the build run on those altered topics to generate the PDF. And then we replaced the altered topics with the original topics so that your content is not permanently changed based on the build event. That gets tricky. It gets a little bit convoluted because, like I said, the build doesn't stop for the build event. And you can work with unaltered. You might have a mix of altered and unaltered content depending on how much content that you're using. So what we would do is we'd run an independent build event, like outside of a build, just run this as an executable to do that alteration, then run the build, then basically run and undo a different build event to undo that information. So the PDF is a little bit trickier because you have to get to that content before it's built, but there are ways to do it, yes.
Excellent, Ray, thank you. You were delving into areas I hadn't even thought about. That's a little bit sneaky and tricky, doing kind of a temporary directory. I like that. All right, so if you want to go and review some of the answers I provided, again, just in case you want to correct me anywhere, and anybody else, we do have a few more minutes. So if you'd like to type a question into that question and answer panel, you can feel free to do that. And one of the things that I am going to touch on, because Ray has brought it up several times, because the pre-build events do run concurrently, I don't have permission to mention the name of the customer, and that's just not under NDA or anything. I don't want to share or name drop unless I have permission. But I remember a customer that really wanted to run some pre-build scripts. They were doing API documentation, and this was a few years ago. They were using the Microsoft Sandcastle process. And so they basically had a pre-build that would run Sandcastle, extract the developer written documentation from the source code, inject it into some snippets that they had pre-written that were just basically staging containers. And they ran that off of target A, Then when target A completed, then they would run target B, which was the actual production build, which was now building, referencing the snippets they had just written from the sandcastle process. I hope that made sense. So that was another technique I'd seen another customer use where they did want to pre-build, but they weren't 100% certain it would finish in a timely manner. So they would just trick flare. They would run build A, which would run the pre-build script, but it was just kind of a dummy build. Then they would run build B, which would now basically absorb all the benefits of the pre-built script on build A. I know, again, a little bit kludgy, but just something I've seen somebody do.
No, that totally makes sense too. I mean, that's one of the things that we tried doing, having two separate builds. And the only alteration that I would make to what you said there is that we actually, I believe, I don't know if it's still there, but in the past, you've been able to execute a build from the command line in Flare. And so we added that command to a post-build event for build one, so that build one did the pre-build event, altered the content, then did a post-build event that kicked off build two.
And brilliant.
Like you said, it's a little kludgy. You kind of got to trust that the computer's doing the right thing in the background. It gets very Judgment Day kind of, that's why we call it Judgment Day. But yeah, that would be the one thing that I would say that we would do differently in that situation is we'd kick off the second build with a post-build event. But yeah, that's exactly how we would do it.
All right, now I see a couple of good questions coming in. So I'll kind of paraphrase and I'll let Ray answer. For those of us who don't want to write our own scripts, where can we find scripts that others have written? I'm afraid there's not going to be a great answer to this one, but maybe I'm wrong. What are your thoughts, Ray? My thoughts are this is getting custom enough. It's going to be tough to use somebody else's generic script, but I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, I would say that what I have tried to do here is try to make these scripts as portable as possible, but it still does require some specific configuration. And that's what I tried to go over today is how to configure these scripts to work. Your content is going to be, it's going to be very close and personal to your organization. So it's going to be a little difficult to have something that's generic enough to do your own content. To take something generic and use it in your content. I would say that this is something that's going to be very custom to your environment. It's not something that's going to be easily commodified, I guess, if that's a word, so that I can just send over a plugin and you can automatically do some different things. There's one example. I'm actually talking about this at Mad World this year. More build event stuff. There's one example that I can show you that I will be showing you during Mad World that is just, it's easy to implement, but it doesn't do a lot either. So I would say that if this approach is something that you're interested in, feel free to reach out and ask questions about it. I'll do the best that I can to provide you answers, but your best bet is going to be having someone who kind of understands XSL and kind of understands the structure of your data and what it is that you're trying to accomplish. It's very custom to your environment. And the intent here is just to show the things that are capable, not necessarily to show this is exactly how to do it in your environment, unfortunately. Sorry about that.
All right, so if we didn't get to your question, apologies, but we are right up on the hour. As everything gets processed, all of the questions that were sent in will be converted into kind of an FAQ document with answers included. You can always feel free, once this gets posted live on the website, there will be links to the recording, links to the FAQ with all the answers to all the questions, and then also links to the sandbox that Ray has so kindly provided. But with that, thank you so much, Ray. This was an awesome presentation. Thank you, everybody, for participating and attending. Watch your inbox for that email when everything gets posted. But with that, have a great rest of today and an even better of your week. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.